Our first reading, or our second reading for this morning, is from the prophet Isaiah. The first 5 chapters or so of Isaiah contain oracles against God's own people for their failure to live by God's ways. Injustice and corruption, especially failure to protect the poor and the needy and the weak, have caused God to be upset and angry. Within the oracles, though, is the promise of hope, of God's renewal, that God will set things right. In our particular reading today, as we hear that, there is a word translated instruction. The word in Hebrew is Torah, and more typically, it's translated as law, especially to speak of the law given at Sinai to Moses. And just an interesting side note, this is one of the few oracles in the Bible that appears in whole in the books of more than one prophet. It's here in Isaiah. It's also in the book of Micah. Listen now for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. The word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, we have arrived. At least on the secular calendar, we are officially in the Christmas season. The Thanksgiving parades have passed by with Santa bringing up the rear, and no one can complain anymore that it's too early for Christmas music or decorations at the mall. Now, when I was growing up, this was the time of year when genuine excitement about Christmas really started to kick in, when my brother and I would start to dream about what gifts would make for an absolutely perfect Christmas morning. Now, we grew up in the church. We got taken to Sunday school pretty much every Sunday, and so we knew well the real Christmas story with Joseph and Mary in a manger. It was a beautiful story, a story filled with warmth that was a big part of my family's Christmas tradition. But that story had next to nothing to do with my excitement as Christmas drew near. If Christmas was going to change my life, if it was going to make me happier or better in some way, it didn't have anything to do with Jesus. If it did, it was going to be because of Santa, or at least some of Santa's helpers. Now, I really doubt that my experience is all that unusual. I mean, our hopes for Christmas, well, Jesus may be the reason for the season, But I'm not sure how much our hopes are about Jesus or Christian faith. We don't really expect that much from Jesus and faith in this season. If there's going to be any magic from Christmas, it's to be found in a little goodwill, some being kind to people, the warmth of nostalgia, the gathering of families, the joy of children. Those last two help explain why there won't be a lot of people here with you if you come for worship on Christmas Day this year, one of those dreaded years when it falls on a Sunday. Many people, and I don't necessarily exclude myself from this group, would just as soon be at home with loved ones, enjoying the delight of children as they open presents, or remembering such delight as you open your own. Now, if you're worried that I'm ramping up to go on a rant about the need to recover the real meaning of Christmas or to decommercialize it, you needn't. I'm all for simplifying, for toning down the conspicuous consumerism. But I think that many of us invest so much in Christmas because it speaks to deep longings that many people feel. Longings for goodwill among people, for families and communities to be united, for us to know once more the joy, the hope, perhaps even the naivete of children. And such longings are not peculiar to Christians. That's one of the reasons that many people enjoy Christmas who really are not part of the church at all. For a moment, it's possible to think about goodwill, to feel a little more hope, a little more joy. For a few weeks, we become part of something and can, for the moment, imagine a slightly better world. Perhaps that's the best we can hope for. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks sounds wonderful. But what are the odds? The prophet spoke these words nearly 3,000 years ago, and since then we've just gotten better at wars and killing. Maybe we should just be happy with a little Christmas cheer and goodwill and leave it at that. Our scripture reading this morning says, the word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. I usually think of hearing a word, but Isaiah saw this one. He received a vision that he shares. The vision is not a vision of weapons turned into farming implements. That happens because of the vision. The vision is of Mount Zion lifted up higher than anything else, and peoples from all the nations streaming to God's temple. And there God does two things. God teaches and God arbitrates between nations. People are instructed in the ways of God so that they can live in these ways. Instruction, Torah, goes out from Jerusalem, and God also judges between nations. And because of this, because people learn and know God's ways, because God settles disputes between the nations, war is no longer necessary. There is no need to learn war anymore. Now, in Isaiah's vision, the people do not bring about peace. God does. But that is in some days to come. In a dream glimpsed only by the prophet. What about now? To which the prophet answers, O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. According to the prophet, God's future calls us, demands of us, that we begin to walk in the ways of that future now. Now, as we enter into another Advent season, a season of waiting, of getting ready, preparing, hoping, I find myself wondering just what we are hoping and preparing for, just what it is that we long for. Can we hope, prepare for something more than a good Christmas? Or is that about all we can manage? I ask for myself as much as for any of you. Sometimes it feels like a real success would simply be if we were a little kinder, a little nicer and more caring for most of December. But other days I have a little more faith. And on those days I can hope, even trust, that God is faithful. Not that God will make everything happy and wonderful, but that the future belongs to God. And in the end, the future will be bent to God's will. On those days when my faith is a little stronger, I can hear the prophet calling me to walk in the light of the Lord. I can hear Jesus calling us to follow him as disciples, learning his ways and sharing them with others. But of course, Jesus has lots of teachings and ways. There are lots of commandments, instruction, Torah of God that I either don't know or not all that inclined to follow. And then again, I was born and grew up in a world where Christian faith was more often about believing in Jesus than it was in actually doing what he said. But I'm convinced that right now, perhaps more than ever, the world desperately needs disciples much, much more than it needs believers. And disciples are those who are shaped and formed by the ways of Jesus, by his commandments, by the instruction of God, ways that are often at odds with our culture, ways that seem strange and difficult and sometimes dangerous. Some of you may be familiar with Diana Butler Bass, an author who we have several of her books in the church library, and who just happens to live down the road a ways in Alexandria. Like many people, she has been horrified, even distraught, at the way this recent election has stoked hatred in our country, how it seems to have empowered hate groups and emboldened them. and she's spoken a lot about this, but the other day on her Facebook page, she posted a much more hopeful note. She wrote, "This morning, a Muslim vendor at the local farmer's market cheered me up. She was amazing. There's nothing new here," she said. "It is just all in the open now, and that's an opportunity for good people to do good." Or as the prophet Isaiah might say, it's an opportunity to walk in the light of the Lord. Or as Jesus might say, it's an opportunity to live as my disciples. Of course, that brings us back to the issue of learning, teaching, instruction, Torah. And that's not just an Old Testament thing. It's not just about Old Testament. When the risen Jesus commissions the church in the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says that disciples are made through two ways: baptism, and by teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. This Advent season, let us prepare by recommitting ourselves to being shaped and formed by the commandments of Jesus, by the instruction of God, that we may walk in the light of the Lord and show the world a small glimpse of the new day that God will bring. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus and calls us to new life as his disciples. Thanks be to God.